Welcome everyone to the latest edition of the You A Mixtape podcast. I'm your host, Jason. Hope you're staying well. Hope you're staying safe. Today, we're going to be talking about Existential Positive Psychology and the 11th Biennial International Meeting Conference. I recognize that's a bit of a mouthful, but thankfully we have Tim Yu as a guest to explain it all to us. Tim, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me.
So talk to us about the 11th Biennial. I'm going to say this whole mouthful again here. The 11th Biennial International Meeting Conference. What does it all mean?
Well, I'll tell you a bit about it. Firstly, if you want to shorten a bit, just meeting conference is fine. Secondly, it's 11th because we've been doing this for, 11 times in a row. But since it's biannual, we've been doing this actually for 20 years, which is pretty cool. I'm just 21. So they started this like before I was born, which is really a long time. But yeah, it's a place where psychology experts and mental health specialists gather together and talk about relevant issues about, mental health in society. Like, for instance, all the consequences of the latest pandemic and, isolation and feeling alone and maybe needing human connections and all those things. It's just a place where people can talk about all sorts of things relating to mental health and psychological well-being.
And that's really the big thing that they're pushing for this year is vulnerability, resilience, and well-being in the pandemic. And, I've talked to a number of people so far in recording this podcast, and a lot of people are kind of saying the same. It's like, it started out a little bit scary, but you kind of took the uniqueness of things and whatnot. And by now that we're a year in, especially for musicians, there's a lot of, trepidation. There's a lot of, uncertainty going forward. How does a conference like this provide a platform, or at least a venue for people to talk about a lot of the uncertainty that they're feeling?
Right. Because the thing is, our conference, it stands out from other conferences, psychology conferences, because we're more into exploring the dark side of, existing, or the dark side of humanity. Because the thing is, you could look at all the positive sides like happiness and maybe well-being and flourishing, but unless you incorporate the negative side of existence, you don't really have a full picture of, human beings. And it's really shown this pandemic that if you just focus on the positive side of things, it really doesn't help, when you're dealing with adverse circumstances. So that's why this conference is really geared towards that. It's about resilience and finding spirituality. As my boss talks about, it's like putting the soul back into psychology. And it's, generally people in the past have said that it really helped them. The participants always rate the conferences pretty well. Testimonials are pretty good. So it seems like it is helping people cope with whatever adversity they're facing, and perhaps finding some new strategies in learning how to live with these, these givens, these existential givens.
Now, one of the things that really intrigued me when I was reading about this conference was the phrase Existential Positive Psychology. Can you give me a bit of a breakdown as to, kind of what all that encompasses?
Right. Yes. So as you could see from the words itself, existential positive psychology, it's really a merger between two great psychology disciplines, existential psychology and positive psychology. This all started back when, the psychologist I work for, Dr. Paul Wong, also the organizer and founder of this conference, he was developing a sort of framework that captures the entire spectrum of human existence. So he was looking at existential psychology and noticing how negative it was. It's like it's better to have a balance. So he looked at positive psychology, which is like all the positive things, right? So having a good balance makes for really useful framework when dealing with all sorts of things from addiction to, this mental health crisis during the pandemic. But on top of those two things, existential positive psychology incorporates all sorts of, disciplines and techniques into his framework. And that's why Paul likes to talk about this as a big tent approach, just incorporating everything into something that's usable.
When you think about people coping through some of the the hardest times, and let's be honest, this last year has really been kind of like some of the hardest times. a lot of people, when they're going through this, or anything in their life, they lean towards music sometimes and they use that as a coping mechanism. How is it that, different kinds of music can work for different kinds of people? And do you see trends of people, researching out certain types of music when it comes to them trying to feel a certain way or at least get themselves out of a funk?
Yeah, music has been always, I think, throughout history, a really great coping mechanism. When I started encountering, the really great classical musicians back when I was a kid, Beethoven or even, Smetana or other of these musicians that have really encountered a lot of loss in their lives. Beethoven lost his hearing at a really young age. Smetana lost, his daughter. So it's just these things that really get translated into music. And I think that the evidence is there that, the more tragedy that someone suffers, the more beautiful their art is, whether it's music or visual arts or whatever. So in the modern time, I feel like, musicians are doing that sort of thing as well. The albums and songs that are released during the pandemic really reflects that. And that's always a good thing because it's like channeling that inner negativity into something that's really beautiful. People can always compare this with a butterfly transforming out of its cocoon. So yeah, it's a good thing to see.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So, some of the music that's coming out, basically has some of that, you know, those feelings, those isolationist feelings. Do you feel that artists right now are leaning on that writing in order to be able to get those feelings out? And do you feel like that's going to be the kind of thing that people are going to associate with and get through, these last few months? We hope last few months of the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually looking at some of the submissions that were coming in for the conference because we're looking for musicians to play at it. And one of the albums that came in was a recently, like recently created album that's called The Phoenix, which is like the perfect metaphor because Phoenix rising out of the ashes. So I feel like not I mean, a lot of musicians nowadays are really touching on this theme. I myself have written several songs that's surrounded the pandemic, and I kind of feel like it's a good way to cope with all the chaos and absurdity that's around us.
One of the other things that I found really interesting is one of the kind of the topics that was being, talked about on the websites was the concept of dialectical mindset. So can you give me a brief, a layman's term explanation of dialectical mindset, and basically, because it sounds like a lot. It
Oh,
does.
yeah, yeah. When I first came across that term, yeah, I thought it was a lot too, but it's really quite simple. Like I said before, there's no positives without negatives, right? There's no light without darkness. So if you look at the world in that way and have this dialectical thinking, it makes for a much more balanced approach to mental health, but just anything in general, just looking at the world. When Dr. Paul Wong developed this concept, he was looking at it from a very Confucianist view because he does have a Eastern background, right? He was born in China, he grew up in Hong Kong. So when he brought this over to, North American psychology, people were initially, confused by this whole thing. But it seems like by integrating both the positive and negatives instead of just focusing on the positive, which, a lot of psychology nowadays does, it makes for a better understanding of human existence.
You see a lot with music when it comes to people almost being very guarded of their genres or very adverse to other genres. Does that dialectical mindset allow someone to kind of get out of that, well, I don't like country music, so all country music sucks kind of mindset?
Yes, well, I think when it comes to aesthetics, there's some people have certain aesthetics and other people have others. But if you're talking about just accepting concepts or ideas, and music is really an idea, I suppose it does help. It allows everyone to get a more broader view of the things that are out there. This is related to another concept called transcendence, that's proposed by really famous psychologists like Abraham Maslow or Viktor Frankl. Being able to transcend our differences and see what it's really about is, I think, something that would really help society right now, being so polarized, not in music, or not just in music, but also like politics, or ideas, and that sort of thing would really help.
When it comes to people wanting to change the mindset, change their feelings, change the vibe that they're feeling, I've talked to a number of people who have talked about, like, whether it comes to the beats per minute, the tempo, the genre. How important is it to have music as part of this conference? You mentioned you were looking for musicians to perform, or at least have their music perform, kind of thing. How important is music in all of this?
Well, music is very important, actually. Usually, when people are suffering, having a creative outlet really helps them, let out their feelings. Because keeping those feelings within, it's really not good for their mental health. Um, Additionally, like, we feel like it would be a really great addition to the conference, because a lot of the people that we've contacted, they're also mental health experts, or people that are within the mental health discipline, and on the side they have music just to channel their feelings into something else, because like other people, they too experience negative feelings and negative events once in a while, so it has to go somewhere. And that's why we've included them there, because art is really one of these ways that we can cope with all the suffering and pain that we experience.
For the musicians out there who have just gone through a year of, for lack of a better term, creative loss, they basically had their in some cases their livelihood, not just, for some it's their hobby, for some it's their career, for some it's basically the lifeblood, the thing that gets them through the year. And now you're going to have these situations where they're going to be not afraid, but maybe trepidatious about getting back on stage, getting back to people, getting back to a full house. How can a conference like this help at least start the conversation for getting past some of those fears?
Exactly. Well, thing is, living, whatever sort of career, whatever sort of life, requires courage. That's the thing, because everyone faces dangers and everyone faces threats, because that's just part of existing. There are four existential givens according to this psychiatrist, Yalom. He talks about death, meaninglessness, suffering, and freedom of choice. And suffering is just something that we all face, whether it's financial loss or losing loved ones. But at the same time, it requires us to find the courage to be able to overcome those dangers and those threats. So I know the musicians nowadays, many of them are out of a job. All the venues are closed, and it's really tough on them. But at the same time, it's just when you hit rock bottom that you really find your strength and that courage that you probably didn't think existed within you, to keep going. And I think that's one thing that this pandemic has really shown, is how resilient people can really be under adverse circumstances.
Now, you said you yourself have actually written some songs during the pandemic. How cathartic of an experience was that for you?
Yeah, I suppose for me, it's more like making some sort of meaning out of this chaos, because in the beginning, when everything's locked down, you can't see your friends, and all the classes, I'm a student, all the classes are moved online, and online learning is a little difficult. So it's just making some sort of sense of the situations that we're placed in. I think that without any sort of coherence, people can't really live well, because we need to make some meaning out of what's around us. So I think music really helped me to do that. I remember writing one piece that's really divided into, I think, 4 sections, and each section represents like one stage of the pandemic. So in the beginning, there's like quarantine, then there's like isolation, then there's et cetera, et cetera. So it's just like putting this into a coherent framework where I could like understand, and also like help other people understand what we're going through. So yeah, I think that's how it worked out for me. But for others, it probably, maybe if they lost someone, it could be in memory of that that person, or if they just want to express their anger or their frustration, then they probably write into their music.
Now, before, you said that this conference was happening every 2 years, so obviously before, this was happening actually in person. Now that the conference is moving virtually, and that's happening August 6th to 8th, what can attendees of the conference expect?
Yeah, exactly. We've actually done a major shift. We were initially just thinking of doing Zoom, but we've invested quite a bit in getting a new conference platform called Feedloop, which is used by all the other major psychological associations. Feedloop will allow us to not only, present everything in a very organized way so everyone knows where they're going, but also allows for participant interactions, meet the speaker so they could talk to the speaker. It allows them to engage in activities like Qigong. We're going to have a Qigong master there teaching how to that sort of practice or how to do it. It's also going to allow for musicians to play because there's going to be like social hours. There's also going to be an art exhibit, of art that's drawn or made during the pandemic. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot more features online. Plus, since it's online, it means that like people from around the world, if they don't want to travel or that fee is preventing them, then they could always attend, and get connected, which is certainly a big advantage compared to in-person stuff.
Some people who have just had to put their conventions online, whatever the avenue or the arena that they have their conventions in, the concept of being able to go virtual and, like you said, to have almost a worldwide audience available to them. Do you see this conference, maybe not going full virtual, but at least having a virtual component of it every year, or at least every instance going forward?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what the founders have in mind. As Lillian said, Paul's wife, she's like, oh, the virtual conference is here to stay. So at this point, we're investing in this platform. We're going to make future conferences hybrid because this is probably what the new normal is going to look like.
So anyone who's, at least, their interest is sparked from listening to this conversation, what would you say to people who are at least now considering attending?
Right. So once again, this conference is all about the negative side of human existence and just, what to do with it, what to do with suffering, what to do with pain, what to do with trauma. So, this conference is really about finding strength in vulnerability. It's about flourishing through suffering. It's also finding joy in our suffering and hardships. So if you feel like, you want to do something, but it's like, there's that pain and suffering around, this conference is really a hopeful light that, can really show the way of how to turn these negative things into something that's really beneficial for one's mental health and well-being.
Now, Tim, we've gotten to the point in the podcast where normally I would say, if you were to introduce yourself to a person, by handing them a mixtape, what songs would be on the tape. We're not going to do that this episode. We're going in a slightly different direction. So, Tim, if you had to make a mixtape for someone who's basically trying to deal with, their vulnerability, their well-being through all of this, if you were to put together a well-being meaning mixtape, what songs would be on that tape and why are those songs there?
Right. Well, do I get to know what that person's genre is? Like what genre they like?
You know what? Any genre. Any genre.
Any genre. Okay, fair enough. So, if I really want to, I could give them a whole list of classical music because I bet there's a lot of selections in there that would really speak to them. But I think I'd give them. I think we'll start with something that's a little more modern. So if I was suggesting a couple of songs, I'd probably choose some, Dylan tracks, some Leonard Cohen, some, Cash. And those artists really speak to the inner, existential side of human beings. And I find their lyrics and their songs to be really deep and moving. So I'd probably suggest some of them. I'd also include some tracks from the blues genre. I recently discovered this after, taking a course in it. I found that many of the songs really, really spoke to me as well, during the pandemic. So I would probably include something like, I don't know, Hard Time Killing Floor Blues by Skip James, something like that, that would really talk about how, resonates with one's suffering. Yeah, and then other things would probably be, what's going on, that sort of thing. Because, during this pandemic, there's a lot of racial tensions, so what's going on by, Marvin Gaye would probably be great for that sort of thing. So yeah, it'd be a very diverse playlist from a lot of genres. Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And for anyone who's curious about the conference, how can they, get information about it, and how can they sign up to attend virtually?
I'm glad that you asked. Well, it's really easy to access our conference. All you have to do is just type in meaning.ca, meaning as meaning in life. So meaning.ca/conferences. And then on there, you'll find all the details about the conferences as well as the registration link.
Tim, thanks so much. And for all of you listening to the podcast, thank you so much for tuning in. If you're listening to us on an audio streaming platform, you can watch this entire video on YouTube. But if you're watching on YouTube, you can download it from any of the audio streaming platforms and listen to it on the go. Until next time, this is the You A Mixtape podcast. I'm your host, Jason. We'll see you next time.